People like her don't belong in rooms like this. The sentence didn't just land. It echoed, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the low hum of a Manhattan rooftop restaurant where every chair cost more than most people's monthly rent, and every conversation carried the weight of money, power, and quiet arrogance. Forks paused midair. A glass of red wine hovered just before a sip, and at the center of it all stood Alicia Brooks, 24, black uniform pressed, posture straight, eyes lowered, not in shame, but in control, her fingers steady on a silver tray even as the words tried to shake something deeper. She had heard things like this before, softer sometimes, disguised as jokes or compliments, but never this loud, never this intentional, and yet she didn't respond, didn't defend herself, because survival had taught her that silence was often safer than truth. Across the room, seated at a table reserved for names that moved markets, Jonathan Hayes watched it happen. Billionaire, tech visionary, the kind of man whose decisions could erase companies overnight. But in that moment, he wasn't thinking about stock prices or acquisitions. He was thinking about the sound of that sentence, how familiar it felt, how it dragged something old and uncomfortable to the surface, a memory he hadn't visited in years. He didn't move at first, didn't interrupt, because no one else did, not the manager pretending to adjust a menu, not the guests who glanced and then looked away, not the ones who smirked behind polished glasses. The man speaking, Travis Cole, laughed lightly as if he'd said something clever, leaning back in his chair like the room belonged to him, like respect was optional, like people were categories instead of human beings. Alicia shifted slightly, just enough to set down a glass without spilling a drop, her training flawless, her expression unreadable, but her grip tightened for half a second, a detail so small, almost no one noticed. Except Jonathan. Something in his chest pulled tight. Not anger, not yet. But recognition, the kind that creeps in slowly before it demands action. He glanced around once more, giving the room a chance to correct itself, to prove him wrong. But it didn't. The silence stretched, heavy, complicit, and then Travis leaned forward again, lowering his voice just enough to make it worse, just enough to turn cruelty into something intimate. And that was when Jonathan exhaled, long and controlled, setting his glass down with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than anything else in the room. He hadn't stood up yet, hadn't spoken, but something had already shifted, something invisible but undeniable, like the moment before a storm breaks, and Alicia, without looking up, felt it too, that subtle change in the air, that quiet signal that for the first time that night, someone had actually seen her. The room did not explode into chaos. It tightened, like a breath held too long. As Jonathan Hayes finally rose from his chair, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a calm that carried far more weight than anger ever could, his suit catching the soft amber light as he stepped away from a table where billion-dollar decisions were usually made in whispers, and suddenly every whisper stopped. Travis Cole noticed first, his smirk lingering for a second too long before uncertainty flickered behind his eyes, because men like him understood power even when they pretended not to, and Jonathan was power, the kind you do not challenge, the kind you do not ignore. Alicia remained still, her tray now resting against her hip, her gaze fixed just ahead, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile control she had built over years of being underestimated. But inside, something was shifting, something unfamiliar, because no one had ever stepped forward before, not like this, not in a room designed to protect people like Travis and overlook people like her. Jonathan stopped a few feet away, not looking at Alicia yet, not offering comfort or sympathy, because this was not about saving her. This was about correcting something that should never have been broken in the first place. He looked directly at Travis, his expression unreadable, his voice measured and steady when he finally spoke. Do you know what the most expensive mistake in business is? The question hung in the air, confusing, disarming, and Travis let out a small laugh, trying to regain control. I think I am doing just fine, he replied, glancing around as if the room would support him, but the room had already chosen silence. Jonathan nodded slightly, as if acknowledging an answer that had just proven his point, then took another step closer, lowering his voice just enough that people leaned in to hear. It is not a bad deal. It is not a failed investment. It is showing everyone exactly who you are when you think it does not matter. And that was when the shift became undeniable. Phone slowly lifting, eyes widening. The quiet electricity of something irreversible beginning to spread. Travis straightened in his seat, his confidence now forced. "Look, if this is about her, I was just joking," he said. The word joking sounding weaker the moment it left his mouth, and Jonathan did not interrupt, did not react. Just let the silence stretch until the excuse collapsed under its own weight. Then, without raising his voice, without a single hint of emotion, he said, "You are currently negotiating a partnership with Hayes Dynamics." And Travis blinked, confusion replacing arrogance, because that was exactly why he was in that room, why this dinner mattered, why he had been so certain he could say anything and still win. Jonathan continued, "That conversation is over." And this time there was no mistaking it, no room for interpretation, no polite way to recover. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and final, and for the first time that night, Travis had nothing to say. Alicia's breath caught, just slightly, as she finally looked up, not at Travis, but at Jonathan, trying to understand what had just happened. Because this was not a gesture, this was not kindness, this was consequence, real and immediate. Jonathan turned then, just for a moment, meeting her eyes, and in that brief exchange, there was no pity, no performance, just recognition, the kind that says I see you without needing to say anything at all, and in a room built on power, that quiet moment carried more impact than anything money could buy. No one spoke after that, not because they were told to be quiet, but because something far more powerful had taken over the room, a kind of awareness that made every movement feel deliberate, every breath measured, as if the entire space had been forced to look at itself in a mirror it could not avoid. Travis sat frozen, his earlier confidence now replaced by the slow realization that the rules he thought protected him no longer applied, his fingers tapping once against the table before, stopping completely, unsure of what came next when power no longer answered to him. Across from him, guests who had laughed moments ago now avoided eye contact, suddenly fascinated by their plates, their phones, anything that did not require them to acknowledge what had just unfolded, because silence had always been easier than accountability. Alicia remained where she stood, but something in her posture had changed, almost imperceptible, her shoulders no longer carrying the same invisible weight, her grip on the tray relaxed just enough to breathe, because for the first time in a long time, she was not shrinking to fit the room. The room was adjusting around her. Jonathan Hayes did not return to his seat immediately. He stayed there for a moment, not to dominate the space, but to let the moment settle, to make sure it was understood, not as a spectacle, but as a boundary that had been drawn and would not be crossed again. Then, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, he turned slightly and addressed the manager, who had been standing nearby, uncertain and silent. "I believe your staff deserves a work environment where they are treated with respect," he said, his tone calm, almost conversational, but carrying a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. The manager nodded quickly, relief and tension mixing in his expression, because this was not just a correction, it was a standard being set in real time. Alicia exhaled quietly, a breath she did not realize she had been holding, and for a brief second, she allowed herself to feel it, not victory, not triumph, but something steadier, something deeper, dignity acknowledged without needing to be demanded. Jonathan finally moved back toward his table, but before he sat down, he paused, glancing once more in Alicia's direction, and this time he spoke directly to her, his voice lower, intended only for her to hear, yet somehow carrying across the silence. "You handled that with more composure than anyone else in this room." And it was not praise, not a compliment meant to impress. It was recognition, simple and honest. Alicia met his gaze fully now, no hesitation, no lowering of her eyes, just a quiet nod, because she understood something in that moment that went beyond the situation, beyond the room, beyond even him. That respect was not something given by status or taken by force. It was something revealed when someone chose to stand where it mattered most. And as conversations slowly began to return, softer now, more careful, the atmosphere had shifted in a way no one could undo, because what had happened was not just a disruption. It was a reminder that power without principle is fragile, and sometimes, all it takes is one decision, one voice, one moment of clarity to change the way an entire room sees itself. The music returned first, soft and cautious, like the room was asking permission to breathe again. But it was not the same music, not the same atmosphere, because something invisible had shifted, something that could not be undone by a piano note or a refill of wine. Conversations resumed in fragments, quieter, more measured, as if every word now carried the awareness that someone might actually be listening, that actions might actually matter. Alicia moved again, but not the same way she had before, not invisible, not automatic. Each step now grounded in something steadier, something she had not felt in this space until tonight. And as she passed by tables that once ignored her, she noticed the difference, small but undeniable. Eyes meeting hers for a second longer, voices softening, gestures becoming more deliberate, because respect, once exposed, has a way of demanding space. Across the room, Jonathan Hayes sat back in his chair, but he was not relaxed, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, his gaze unfocused for a moment, not on the people around him, not on the deals waiting to be discussed, but somewhere further back, somewhere quieter, where memory does not ask for permission before it arrives. Years ago, long before the tailored suits and private rooftops, before his name carried weight in rooms like this, there had been another room, smaller, less polished, where he had watched someone he respected stand alone in the face of dismissal, where he had done nothing, where silence had felt easier than risk, and that moment had stayed with him, not loud, not constant, but present, like a shadow that only appears when the light hits just right. He had built an empire since then, learned how to negotiate, how to win, how to control outcomes. But tonight was not about control, it was about correction, about choosing differently when the same pattern tried to repeat itself. At a nearby table, a woman leaned toward her companion, whispering something about what had just happened, her tone no longer amused but thoughtful, almost unsettled, as if she was reconsidering more than just the moment. And her companion nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition. At the service station, another server glanced at Alicia, offering a small nod, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just enough to say I saw it too. And Alicia returned it with the slightest lift of her chin, because sometimes acknowledgement does not need words. Travis remained seated, but smaller somehow, his earlier presence reduced, not by force, but by consequence, his phone lighting up briefly as if offering distraction. But even that could not restore what had been lost, because reputation, once cracked, does not repair easily. Jonathan finally reached for his glass again, but he did not drink immediately. Instead, he looked out over the city skyline stretching beyond the glass walls. Millions of lights scattered across the darkness, each one representing a life, a story, a moment where someone chooses who they are going to be when it counts. And he understood something with a clarity that did not need explanation. That power is not proven in the deals you close, but in the lines you refuse to let be crossed. And somewhere behind him, Alicia adjusted her tray, took a steady breath, and stepped forward into the next table, not as someone trying to belong, but as someone who already did, whether the room had realized it yet or not. The night did not return to normal. It recalibrated, like a system quietly rewriting its own code, and the difference could be felt in the smallest details, in the way chairs no longer scraped as loudly, in the way voices softened before finishing a sentence, in the way people now glanced at the staff not out of habit, but out of awareness. Alicia noticed it with every step she took, every glass she placed, every order she confirmed, because the same room that once moved around her as if she were invisible was now adjusting its rhythm to include her presence. And it was not dramatic, not theatrical, but it was real, and real was something she trusted more than applause. At Jonathan's table, the conversation resumed, but the tone had changed, his colleagues speaking with a careful respect that had less to do with fear and more to do with understanding, because what he had done was not just a statement, it was a standard, and standards, once set, reshape everything around them. One of the executives across from him cleared his throat, attempting to return to business, mentioning projections, timelines, numbers that usually filled rooms like this with energy, but even those words seemed lighter now, less dominant, because everyone present knew that something more important than profit had just taken place. Jonathan listened, nodding occasionally, but his attention drifted again, not away from the conversation, but deeper into it, as if he was weighing not just the deal, but the people involved in it, measuring something beyond spreadsheets and signatures. A few tables away, Travis finally stood, not with the confidence he had arrived with, but with the quiet urgency of someone who understood that staying longer would not change anything, his chair sliding back with a soft sound that drew brief glances, but no sympathy. And as he walked toward the exit, no one stopped him, no one acknowledged him, because the room had already moved on without him. Alicia saw him pass, just for a second, and for a moment, the old instinct to look down returned, the habit of making herself smaller, but she did not follow it. She kept her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, because tonight had taught her something she could not unlearn, that dignity does not need permission once it is recognized. Near the service station, the manager approached her, his tone unusually careful, asking if she was all right, offering a break if she needed one. And Alicia shook her head gently, not out of obligation, but because she was, for the first time during a shift like this, completely steady, grounded in a way that had nothing to do with the job itself. Jonathan eventually rose again, but this time not to intervene, not to correct, just to move, and as he stepped away from his table, he paused briefly beside Alicia, not blocking her path, not interrupting her work, just aligning his pace with hers for a second. "What is your name?" he asked, simple, direct, without assumption, and she answered without hesitation, "Alicia," her voice calm, clear, carrying none of the uncertainty that had once lived beneath it. He nodded once, as if committing it to memory, not as a formality, but as something that mattered, and then he continued on, leaving behind not a scene, not a spectacle, but a shift that would remain long after the night ended. And as Alicia turned back to her next table, the skyline reflecting in the glass behind her, she realized that nothing about her job had changed, and yet everything about how she was seen had. And sometimes, that is where real change begins, not in the role you play, but in the way the world finally chooses to recognize it. The night stretched forward, but it no longer felt like just another shift. It felt like a turning point that no one had planned, but everyone could feel, a quiet shift in gravity that changed how people stood, how they spoke, how they chose their words when they thought no one was paying attention. Alicia moved between tables with the same precision, the same professionalism, but inside, something had settled into place, something that had been missing for years, not confidence, because she had always had that, but confirmation, the kind that does not come from praise or approval, but from a moment where the world is forced to acknowledge what was always there. At the far end of the room, a young couple lowered their voices as she approached, the man straightening slightly, offering a polite thank you as she set down their drinks, and Alicia nodded, not surprised, not impressed, just aware that respect, once introduced, tends to ripple outward in ways no one can fully control. Jonathan Hayes stood near the glass wall overlooking the city, his reflection faint against the skyline, hands resting loosely at his sides, not in thought, but in stillness, as if he was allowing the moment to pass through him completely before moving on, because he understood something most people in rooms like this often missed, that impact is not always measured in headlines or applause. Sometimes it is measured in the quiet changes no one announces, but everyone carries forward. One of his associates approached cautiously, speaking in a tone that balanced business with curiosity, mentioning how bold the decision had been, how unusual it was to end a deal so directly. But Jonathan did not respond immediately. He simply looked out at the city lights for another second before answering. "It was not bold," he said calmly. "It was necessary," and there was no arrogance in his voice, no need to justify. Just clarity, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where the line is and refusing to pretend it does not exist. Across the room, Alicia paused briefly at the service station, reaching for a fresh set of glasses, and for a moment, her reflection caught in the polished surface of the metal counter, and she saw herself the way she had always been, composed, capable, steady. But now there was something else layered into that image, something that had nothing to do with the uniform or the job, something that could not be taken away by a careless comment or a dismissive glance. The manager walked by again, this time not checking, not hovering, just nodding once in passing, a silent acknowledgement that felt more genuine than any apology could have been. The night continued, orders placed, meals served, conversations resumed, but beneath it all, there was a new awareness, a quiet understanding shared by everyone who had witnessed what happened. That respect is not situational, it is foundational, and once it is enforced, it does not disappear when the moment ends. Jonathan eventually turned away from the window, ready to leave. His presence no longer needed to hold the room together, because the shift had already taken root, and as he walked toward the exit, he passed Alicia one last time, not stopping, not interrupting, just offering a brief glance that carried the same unspoken message as before, recognition without spectacle. And Alicia returned it with the smallest nod, because some exchanges do not need words to be understood. And as the doors opened and closed behind him, the city continuing its endless movement beyond, Alicia stepped forward into her next task, not as someone who had been defended, but as someone who had been seen, and that difference, subtle as it was, changed everything. The doors had closed behind Jonathan, but the weight of his decision lingered in the room like a quiet echo that refused to fade, not loud, not disruptive, but present in every glance, every pause, every choice that followed. Alicia continued her shift, but now there was a rhythm to her movement that felt different, not faster, not slower, just steadier, as if something inside her had aligned in a way that no longer required effort to maintain. And as she carried a tray across the room, she noticed something she had not seen before. People were no longer just noticing her, they were adjusting for her. Chairs pulled in slightly to give her space. Conversations paused instead of continuing over her presence. Small gestures that spoke louder than any apology ever could. Near the corner table, a group of executives lowered their voices as she approached, one of them offering a quiet thank you that carried sincerity instead of habit, and Alicia acknowledged it with a simple nod, not because she needed their approval, but because respect, when genuine, deserves to be met, not ignored. At the service station, another server leaned closer, whispering, "That was something," her tone a mix of admiration and disbelief, and Alicia gave a small, thoughtful smile, not expanding on it, because she understood that what had happened was not meant to be retold as a story, but remembered as a standard. Outside, beyond the glass walls, the city moved on without interruption, taxis weaving through traffic, lights flickering across buildings, a reminder that most of the world would never know what had happened in that room. And yet, for those who were inside it, something fundamental had shifted, something they would carry into other rooms, other conversations, other moments where the choice between silence and action would present itself again. Jonathan stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool night air replacing the controlled atmosphere of the restaurant. And for a moment, he stood still, not checking his phone, not rushing into the next commitment, just allowing the quiet to settle around him. Because moments like this did not need to be broadcast, they needed to be understood, internalized, carried forward without noise. Inside, Alicia finished setting a table, aligning each glass with precision, her reflection faintly visible in the polished surface. And for the first time that evening, she allowed herself a small exhale that carried something close to relief, not because the night had been easy, but because it had been different, because something had been corrected in a way that did not require her to fight for it. The manager passed by once more, this time offering a simple, "Thank you for handling that with professionalism." And Alicia met his eyes briefly, recognizing the shift in tone, the absence of distance, and she nodded, not out of obligation, but out of acknowledgement. As the final tables began to clear and the energy of the room softened into the closing hours, Alicia gathered her last tray, moving toward the back. But before she disappeared through the service door, she paused for just a second, glancing back at the room that had felt so different only an hour ago. And in that glance there was no resentment, no triumph, just clarity, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are regardless of where you stand. And somewhere in the city, Jonathan began walking again, blending into the movement of people and lights, his presence no longer commanding a room, but the decision he made still quietly shaping one. Because sometimes the most powerful moments are not the ones that make noise, but the ones that change how silence feels forever. By the time the last table was cleared, the restaurant no longer felt like the same place it had been just a few hours earlier. Not because the decor had changed or the lighting had dimmed, but because something less visible had shifted in the people who occupied it, something that would not disappear when the doors closed for the night. Alicia moved through the final routines of her shift with quiet precision, stacking glasses, aligning chairs. Her movements steady and deliberate, but her mind was not replaying the insult, not holding on to the moment of tension. Instead, it returned to something else entirely. That brief exchange of eye contact, that calm voice that had not raised itself to demand attention but had still managed to command the entire room. In the back, the kitchen staff spoke in softer tones than usual. A few glances exchanged, a few quiet nods, as if everyone understood that what had happened was not just an isolated incident, but something that had revealed a standard they had always hoped existed but rarely saw enforced. One of the senior servers approached Alicia as she placed the final set of silverware into its tray, offering a simple, "You handled tonight well." And Alicia responded with a small, genuine smile, because she knew the truth, that she had not done anything different than she always did. She had simply remained herself, and this time, the room had finally met her there. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, but inside, the lights began to dim, each section of the restaurant falling into a quieter version of itself, until only a few scattered reflections remained against the glass walls, mirrors of a night that had carried more weight than anyone had expected. Alicia stepped into the locker room, the hum of the main floor fading behind the door, and for the first time since the evening began, she allowed her shoulders to drop fully, not from exhaustion, but from release, a quiet understanding settling in that she did not have to carry the burden of proving her worth in every room she entered. Because worth is not something that can be assigned or removed by someone else's opinion, she changed slowly, folding her uniform with the same care she had worn it, placing it neatly into her bag, and as she glanced at herself in the mirror, the reflection staring back was the same, but the way she saw it had shifted, not in appearance, but in recognition, the kind that stays long after the moment that created it. As she stepped back into the now nearly empty dining room, the silence felt different, not heavy, not watchful, but settled, like a space that had finally been corrected, and as she made her way toward the exit, she paused briefly near the glass wall where Jonathan had stood earlier, looking out at the city lights, and for a moment, she stood there too, not searching for him, not expecting anything more, just acknowledging that sometimes a single decision, made quietly and without hesitation, can ripple outward in ways that reshape more than just one moment. The door opened, cool air meeting her as she stepped outside, blending into the same city that had not noticed what had happened inside. And yet, for her, everything felt slightly different, not louder, not brighter, just clearer, because she understood now that dignity does not arrive with recognition. It simply waits for the moment when someone refuses to let it be ignored. And that night, someone had refused, and that was enough to change everything. The city did not slow down for moments like this. It never does. But as Alicia stepped onto the sidewalk and joined the quiet flow of late-night movement, she carried something with her that the city could not see, yet could not take away. A shift not in circumstance, not in status, but in understanding, the kind that settles deep and changes how you move through every space that follows. The air was cooler now, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the glow of streetlights stretching across the pavement. And for a moment, she paused, adjusting the strap of her bag, not out of hesitation, but to take in the stillness that existed just beneath the noise, the kind of stillness that only comes after something important has already happened. Across the street, a car door closed softly, footsteps echoed briefly, life continuing in its usual rhythm, and Alicia stepped forward again, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, but her presence different, because she was no longer carrying the quiet question of whether she belonged in rooms like that. She had already answered it without saying a word. Somewhere several blocks away, Jonathan Hayes moved through the same city, his pace unhurried, his mind not replaying the conversation, not measuring the cost of the decision he had made, because some choices are not meant to be calculated, they are meant to be lived with, carried forward as a standard rather than a story, and he understood that what had happened inside that restaurant would never appear in a press release, would never be summarized in numbers or headlines. but it would exist in something far more lasting. The way people in that room would choose to act the next time they were given the same opportunity to speak or to stay silent. Back on the street, Alicia reached the corner, the light changing above her, and as she waited, she glanced briefly at her reflection in the dark window of a closed storefront. Not searching for anything new, just recognizing what had always been there. Strength that did not need validation, composure that did not depend on approval, dignity that did not require permission. The signal shifted, and she crossed, blending into the movement of the city, one person among many, and yet carrying a moment that had quietly redefined how at least one space would remember her, not as someone who served, but as someone who stood, even in silence, and as the distance between her and that rooftop grew, the meaning of the night did not fade. It settled, becoming part of something larger than the moment itself, because what changed was not just how one man acted or how one room responded. It was the reminder that power, when guided by principle, does not need to announce itself to be felt, and dignity, once defended, does not need to ask to remain. She did not raise her voice, she did not demand attention, she did not need to, because in the end, it was not about proving anything to anyone. It was about something far simpler and far stronger, that when the right person chooses to act at the right moment, the balance shifts, quietly, permanently, and the world, even in its smallest corners, becomes just a little more honest.